My name is Matthew. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my career, I've worked in marketing strategy, quietly, thoroughly, and usually somewhere just outside the spotlight. If you met me in a meeting, you probably wouldn't remember much about me afterward. I'm not the loudest voice in the room. I don't interrupt. I don't dominate whiteboards. I take notes. I listen. I wait until I have something precise to say. People often mistake that for hesitation. At the agency where this story happened, I was known as reliable, which sounds like a compliment. It usually is. Reliable means you stay late. Reliable means you fix decks at midnight. Reliable means when someone else fumbles a client question, you step in gently and smooth it over. Reliable does not always mean respected. This is the story of what happened when my director began interrupting me in every marketing meeting. Not once, not occasionally, every time. He dismissed my ideas out loud. He reframed them as his own. He smiled while doing it, and the room, smart, educated, professional adults, let it happen. For a while, I did too. This isn't a revenge story. No dramatic outbursts, no slammed doors, no viral LinkedIn expose. It's about documentation. It's about silence used deliberately. It's about how email trails are calm, but they don't forget. What began as a series of small interruptions turned into something much larger, a quiet recalibration of power. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't file a complaint. I didn't threaten to quit. I started sending follow-up emails, clear summaries, bullet points, timestamps, confirmations of what was discussed and who suggested what. At first it looked administrative, polite, organized. It was something else. Over the next several months, the dynamic in that conference room shifted. Not because I forced it to, but because facts, when written carefully and consistently, create their own gravity. This story isn't about destroying someone's career. It's about protecting your own. It's about realizing that sometimes the most powerful move isn't confrontation, it's clarity. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. The small cuts, the normalization, the moment something inside me changed. And how documentation, boring, meticulous documentation, became the most honest form of self-defense I've ever practiced. If you've ever walked out of a meeting feeling smaller than when you walked in, if you've ever had an idea dismissed only to hear it praised 5 minutes later in someone else's voice, you might recognize parts of yourself in this story. So let me ask you something gently. Have you ever been underestimated in a room where you knew you were the most prepared person there? To them, I was dependable. That was the word that followed my name in performance reviews, in Slack threads, in casual hallway introductions. This is Matthew. She's incredibly reliable. Reliable meant I never missed a deadline. It meant I triple-checked projections before client presentations. It meant that if a campaign underperformed, I was already in the data before anyone else noticed. But reliable also meant predictable. And predictable in a marketing agency that worshipped big personalities and fast talkers translated to safe, not threatening. In meetings, I usually sat halfway down the table, not at the head, not at the far end. Close enough to contribute, far enough to fade. I prepared obsessively. I read client briefs twice. I anticipated objections. I outlined strategic angles that weren't flashy, but sustainable. When I spoke, I tried to be concise. I thought that was professionalism. My director, Daniel Reeves, was the opposite of concise. He filled the space effortlessly. He told stories. He laughed loudly. He had that rare skill of speaking in half-formed thoughts that somehow still sounded confident. Clients loved him. So did leadership. When I first joined the team, I admired him. He seemed fearless in rooms that intimidated me. Where I brought spreadsheets, he brought swagger. For a while, our dynamic worked. I built the strategy. He delivered it. And I told myself that was collaboration. In early meetings, when he would jump in right after I spoke, adding a layer, reframing a phrase, I assumed he was amplifying me, supporting the narrative, elevating the idea. Sometimes he would say exactly what Matthew's getting at is, and then proceed to explain my point with more volume and fewer details. The room would nod at him. I would nod too, because technically he hadn't contradicted me. He had just absorbed me. It's strange how invisibility doesn't happen all at once. It accumulates, quietly, like dust. You don't notice the first thin layer. You notice when the surface no longer reflects you. By the second quarter of that year, something subtle had shifted. When clients asked complex strategic questions, eyes would turn to Daniel. Even when I had built the entire framework behind the proposal, he would answer confidently, sometimes accurately, sometimes not. And if there were corrections to be made later, I made them privately, in revised decks, in updated projections, in late-night adjustments no one witnessed. No one was cruel. No one mocked me. No one said I didn't matter. But when credit was distributed, my name rarely came up unless something needed fixing. Matthew will handle it. I became the safety net, the stabilizer, the person who keeps things running. And in a results-driven environment, that role feels stable, secure, until you realize stability without visibility is fragile. I didn't resent Daniel at first. I rationalized everything. He's a senior. He's client-facing. That's just how agencies work. Strategy isn't glamorous. But somewhere beneath my composure, something familiar stirred. The old feeling of being the quiet one at the dinner table while louder siblings debated over me. The sensation of having thoughts fully formed but spoken too late. I told myself I didn't need attention. I told myself the work would speak for itself. I was wrong, because work doesn't speak. People do. And I was about to learn what happens when someone else keeps speaking over you. The first time it really landed, it didn't look dramatic. There was no tension in the room, no raised voices, no awkward silence. It was a Tuesday morning quarterly planning session with one of our largest retail clients. I'd spent the entire weekend modeling a reallocation strategy based on shifting seasonal search trends. It wasn't flashy, it was precise. I walked into the glass conference room 10 minutes early, my black leather notebook tucked under my arm, slides already loaded. Daniel came in 2 minutes before start time, coffee in hand, effortless as always. When it was my turn, I began calmly. I've been looking at the last 3 quarters of conversion data, I said, clicking to the first slide. If we shift 20% of spend into mid-funnel content during late Q2, we can capture the early research phase before competitors scale up. I explained the logic, step by step, search behavior, cost fluctuations, long-term lift versus short-term spikes. No one interrupted. I remember thinking, this is going well. Then, halfway through my third slide, Daniel leaned forward. Right, he said, cutting across my sentence with a casual nod. What Matthew's pointing to, and this is key, is that we need to own the discovery phase earlier. He stood up. He walked to the screen. He repeated my framework in broader, punchier language. Fewer numbers, more conviction. We stop reacting to demand, he said. We shape it. The client's VP smiled. That's exactly the kind of aggressive thinking we need. Aggressive. I hadn't used that word. My version was measured, calculated. But suddenly, it was his narrative. I was still standing beside the table, remote in hand. I told myself it was fine. He was summarizing. Executives like summaries. When the VP asked a follow-up question about projected lift percentages, Daniel turned his head slightly toward me. Matthew ran those models, he said. The attention shifted briefly. I answered clearly. Precisely. 32% projected improvement over 2 quarters. Margin stabilized by Q3. The VP nodded again. Great direction, Daniel. That was the first small cut. Not because he spoke, not because he reframed, but because the credit crystallized in the room. It attached to him. After the meeting, Daniel clapped me lightly on the shoulder. Good stuff, he said. You've got solid instincts. Instincts. I had spreadsheets, regression analyses, and documented trend lines. Instincts sounded accidental. Back at my desk, I opened the slide deck and stared at it for a moment longer than necessary. My name was on the footer. Small, grey text. I tried to analyze my reaction logically. Was I overthinking it? He hadn't contradicted me. He hadn't dismissed the idea outright. He had just stepped in front of it. The team didn't notice anything unusual. No one mentioned it later. In Slack, the recap read, "Client aligned with Daniel's strategic pivot for Q2." I reread that sentence 3 times. Strategic pivot. That was my language from Friday's internal draft. I hovered over the keyboard for a moment, tempted to respond, to clarify. I didn't. It felt petty, technical, like nitpicking phrasing. And so I let it go, but I wrote it down. In my black leather notebook, beneath that day's date, I made a small entry. Q2 retail meeting, Strategy reframed mid-presentation, credit shifted. No emotion, just observation. At the time, I didn't know that habit, writing things down without reacting, would become the foundation of everything that followed. It was only a small cut, but small cuts repeated teach you where you're vulnerable. After the retail meeting, I told myself it had been situational. High-pressure client, executive energy, fast-moving conversation. It wouldn't become a pattern, except it did. The interruptions didn't feel aggressive. That would have been easier to confront. They were smooth, seamless, almost polite. I would begin outlining a campaign concept. Daniel would lean forward slightly. Building on that, he'd say. Or, let me simplify what Matthew's suggesting. Simplify. It became his favorite word. In one automotive pitch, I presented a multi-phase content funnel designed around long decision cycles. I was midway through explaining the retargeting logic when he stepped in. What she's really highlighting, he said to the client, is patience. Most brands panic too early. We won't. He smiled confidently. The client nodded, impressed by the composure of that statement. Patience. That hadn't been the headline of my strategy. Timing mechanics had. Budget efficiency curves. Lead quality ratios. But patience was easier to remember. And suddenly, it was his thesis. The first few times, I rationalized it as translation. Maybe I was too detailed. Maybe executives needed bigger brushstrokes. I adjusted. I shortened my explanations. I led with conclusions instead of process. It didn't change anything. He still interrupted. Not always at the same moment. Not always overtly. Sometimes he'd wait until I finished and then restate the idea with more theatrical conviction. Sometimes he'd jump in mid-sentence, smiling as if we were co-presenting a rehearsed performance. And I played along, because calling it out in the moment would have made me look defensive, emotional, territorial. And women in strategy roles learn quickly which adjectives they cannot afford. Difficult, sensitive, not collaborative. So I normalized it. When colleagues praised Daniel's client instincts, I nodded. When recaps credited his vision, I stayed silent. There's a psychological shift that happens when something subtle repeats often enough. You stop asking whether it's wrong. You start adjusting yourself around it. I began anticipating the interruption. Mid-explanation, part of my brain would track not just my content, but his breathing, his posture, the slight inhale that signaled he was about to take over. I shortened my points to avoid being cut off. Ironically, that made it easier for him. During one internal brainstorming session, a junior associate suggested a variation of an idea I had proposed weeks earlier. Daniel lit up. That's sharp, he said. Exactly the direction we should be thinking. I glanced at my notebook. I had written nearly the same phrasing 2 Mondays before. No one remembered. Not maliciously, just selectively. The room's memory attached itself to the loudest voice. After that meeting, I stayed behind to gather my things. Daniel lingered too. You've been quieter lately, he said casually. I almost laughed. I'm just refining how I present, I replied. He nodded approvingly. Good, executive rooms respond to clarity. Clarity. It was such an interesting word for someone who kept inserting static into my sentences. That night, I opened my laptop and reviewed the last 6 meeting summaries. A pattern emerged. Ideas I introduced were later described as collaborative, then gradually as leadership-driven, then occasionally as Daniel-led pivots. No one erased me outright. They diluted me. And dilution is hard to protest. It doesn't feel sharp enough to demand defense. I still believed in professionalism, in teamwork, in hierarchy, but something inside me had started keeping score. Not emotionally, but structurally. Dates, language shifts, attribution patterns. I wasn't angry. I was studying the system. Because once you realize disrespect has become routine, the question isn't, why is this happening? The question becomes, what role am I unconsciously agreeing to play? The realization didn't arrive all at once. It surfaced in fragments, comments, expectations, subtle positioning. I had been assigned a role, not formally, not in a job description, but socially, structurally. I was the architect no one saw, the insurance policy, the person who made bold ideas functional after someone else claimed them. In team meetings, if a timeline looked unrealistic, eyes drifted toward me. Matthew will pressure test it. If a client flagged inconsistencies in reporting, someone would say, she'll clean that up. I became the quiet reassurance behind louder ambition. And at first that felt safe. necessary. There's comfort in being indispensable, until you realize indispensability without visibility is just dependency. One afternoon during performance review season, I overheard two department heads talking near the break room. Daniel's name came up. "He's got strong executive presence," one of them said. "Real leadership trajectory." Leadership trajectory. I had built the strategic frameworks that sustained those client accounts. I knew which campaigns were fragile and which were scalable. I knew the data before it was summarized into punchlines, but trajectory attaches to visibility, and visibility attaches to volume. A week later, HR circulated an internal nomination form for a cross-functional innovation task force. Daniel forwarded it to the team. "This feels aligned with where we're headed," he wrote. "I'll represent marketing." I stared at that sentence for a moment. I had drafted the proposal that sparked the innovation initiative 3 months earlier, but he would represent it. That's when the role clarified itself fully in my mind. I wasn't meant to represent. I was meant to reinforce. Reliable, detail-oriented, supportive, invisible. It wasn't that anyone explicitly silenced me. It was that the ecosystem had quietly decided who translated ideas into authority and who translated authority back into spreadsheets. During one client workshop, I intentionally paused mid-explanation to see what would happen. Silence stretched. Daniel glanced at me. Then he filled it. "Let me reframe that," he said, smiling. "Of course." The room expected him to speak. They expected me to prepare. That's when I understood something uncomfortable. Part of this dynamic persisted because I had allowed it. I never documented attribution publicly. I never followed up to clarify ownership. I never corrected summaries that subtly shifted credit. I valued harmony, and harmony in this environment required me to shrink slightly, not dramatically, just enough to keep the system comfortable. That afternoon, I opened my black leather notebook and wrote a single sentence across a blank page. What if reliability is being mistaken for replaceability? I stared at it for a long time. Because if the organization saw me as stable infrastructure instead of strategic leadership, then my future here would plateau quietly. No conflict, no explosion, just gradual stagnation. And I realized something else. Daniel wasn't the only one assigning roles. I had been accepting one. The shift didn't happen during a confrontation. It didn't happen after a dramatic meeting or a harsh comment. It happened on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, under fluorescent lighting, with lukewarm coffee beside me. We were in a strategy alignment session for a national healthcare client. High stakes, long contract, executive-heavy room. I had built a 12-month repositioning roadmap that balanced compliance constraints with growth targets. It was careful work, nuanced. Halfway through the presentation, I introduced a phased messaging pivot designed to protect the brand from regulatory scrutiny while still expanding audience reach. Daniel interrupted before I finished my sentence. "Let's not overcomplicate it," he said lightly. "What we're really talking about is being more aggressive in untapped segments." Aggressive. In healthcare, marketing. I felt the temperature in the room change, not physically, but structurally. The client's legal advisor shifted in her seat. I opened my mouth to clarify. Daniel kept going. "We'll push the boundaries. Safely, of course." The legal advisor raised an eyebrow. "Define safely." For the first time in months, he hesitated. Just slightly. He glanced at me. That flicker of uncertainty was small, almost invisible. But I saw it, because I knew the compliance framework. I had built it line by line. I knew exactly where the boundaries were. I spoke calmly. "What Daniel means," I said evenly, "is that Phase 2 targets adjacent segments within existing regulatory allowances. We're not expanding claims, we're expanding audience education." I clicked on the slide he had skipped. I walked through the guardrails. The room relaxed. The legal advisor nodded. "That makes more sense." Daniel smiled. Exactly. The meeting moved on, but something inside me did not. For the first time, I noticed the risk. Not just the irritation, not just the ego shift. Risk. When he reframed my ideas, he wasn't always carrying the full weight of the details behind them. And when details matter, legally, financially, contractually, the person who built the framework understands consequences differently than the person presenting it. After the meeting, Daniel laughed it off. "Good save," he said casually. "I like pushing energy in the room." I studied him for a moment. He didn't see it as interference. He saw it as momentum. And that's when the internal shift happened. Not anger, not resentment. Clarity. I realized that staying silent wasn't neutral anymore. Silence was slowly detaching me from authorship, from accountability, from leverage. If a campaign failed, documentation would matter. If compliance lines blurred, documentation would matter. If leadership evaluated impact, documentation would matter. And right now, the documentation doesn't reflect reality. That afternoon, instead of diving into the next deliverable, I opened a blank email. Subject line, healthcare strategy alignment, key decisions and clarifications. I wrote a calm summary of the meeting. I outlined the phased messaging pivot, the regulatory guardrails discussed, the distinction between aggressive expansion and compliant audience growth, specific ownership assignments. I attributed ideas clearly, not defensively, just factually. Per discussion, the phased regulatory framework developed in advance, see slides 14 to 21, will guide expansion efforts. I CC'd the client team, Daniel included. I read it twice. Neutral tone, no accusation, no emotion, just record. I hit send. There was no immediate response, no tension, no fallout, but something had changed. For the first time, the room's memory didn't rely solely on volume. It had a timestamp, and I realized something powerful. I didn't need to speak louder. I needed to write more clearly. After that first follow-up email, nothing exploded. No one confronted me. No one accused me of being territorial. No one even mentioned it. Daniel replied with a brief, "Looks good. Thanks for capturing." That was it. But something subtle had shifted. Internally, not externally. Before, my silence had been passive. I stayed quiet to preserve harmony, to avoid friction, to maintain the image of being collaborative. Now, my silence had edges. In the next client meeting, I noticed the familiar pattern beginning again. I introduced a data-backed optimization plan. Daniel leaned forward, preparing to summarize. I led him. I didn't rush to finish my sentence. I didn't tighten my posture. I watched. He reframed the strategy in simplified terms. The client nodded, and afterward I sent another email. Subject line, recap, Q3 optimization strategy, attribution and next steps. Bullet points, clean structure, specific language. Initial reallocation model introduced, see slide 8. Simplified executive summary provided in meeting. Data projections attached for detailed review. Ownership, modeling and reporting. Matthew, no emotion, no commentary, just clarity. Over the next few weeks, this became routine. Meeting, interruption, reframe, follow-up email. The tone never changed. Calm, professional, efficient. But something else began to change. In internal Slack threads, when someone referenced a strategic direction, I would reply with a link to the recap. Documented here for context. Not aggressive, not pointed, just anchored. Colleagues started forwarding my summaries to new stakeholders instead of paraphrasing meetings from memory. Clients began replying directly to my emails with technical questions because they could see in writing who owned the framework. Daniel didn't stop speaking over me, but now every reframed idea left a paper trail, and paper trails are patient. What surprised me most was how peaceful I felt. I wasn't rehearsing comebacks anymore. I wasn't replaying meetings at night, wondering if I should have spoken up differently. I knew the record would reflect reality. That knowledge steadied me. In one internal leadership sync, Daniel once again summarized the growth model I had built. "This is the direction we're taking," he said confidently. I nodded. Afterward, I sent the recap. 2 hours later, our VP of strategy responded, "Appreciate the detailed breakdown, Matthew. The phased modeling is strong." It was the first time in months a senior leader had referenced my name in direct connection to strategy, not execution. Daniel didn't then comment, but I noticed he started glancing at his inbox sooner after meetings. Silence, when used deliberately, does something unexpected. It makes other people speak more, and the more someone speaks without documentation, the more contrast forms between performance and proof. I wasn't exposing him, I was documenting myself. That distinction mattered because I didn't want him to fail. I wanted accuracy, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance of certainty in the room began to tilt. Not in volume, in the record. And records, unlike voices, don't fade. If you had watched me from the outside during that period, you wouldn't have seen anything dramatic. I still arrived early, still carried the same black leather notebook, still spoke calmly, still left meetings without visible frustration. What no one noticed was what happened after hours. I began building an archive, not obsessively, not emotionally, systematically. Every meeting recap I sent was saved in a dedicated folder. Every slide deck draft was versioned with timestamps. Every instance where language shifted from Matthew's model to team direction to Daniel's strategy was noted quietly in a spreadsheet only I could see. Date, meeting type, original phrasing, final attribution, no commentary, just pattern recognition. I wasn't trying to build a case against him. I was mapping the ecosystem. In parallel, I did something else. I began strengthening direct client relationships, quietly. After sending recaps, I would occasionally add a line. If helpful, I'm happy to walk through the modeling assumptions in more detail. Not promotional, not territorial, just available. A few clients took me up on it. 15-minute calls turned into 30-minute deep dives into forecasting logic. During those conversations, I noticed something important. When separated from the performative energy of group meetings, clients responded differently. They asked sharper questions. They listened longer. They addressed me directly. One healthcare executive said, almost absent-mindedly, "You're the one who really understands the mechanics behind this." I didn't correct him. I just answered his next question thoroughly. Inside the agency, I also started requesting written confirmations more often, just to confirm alignment. Per today's discussion, documenting next steps. The phrasing stayed neutral, but the habit became consistent. Daniel began adjusting subtly. In meetings, he occasionally paused and said, "Matthew, do you want to walk through the specifics?" It wasn't deference. Not yet. It was awareness. He knew there would be a recap. And recaps reward specificity. Meanwhile, I invested in something else they never noticed. Skill expansion. If my visibility would eventually rely on credibility beyond documentation, I needed leverage that wasn't dependent on him. I enrolled in an advanced analytics certification program, quietly, evenings and weekends. I deepened my fluency in attribution modeling tools that most strategists in the agency only reference superficially. I wasn't preparing to leave. I was preparing to become undeniable, because documentation alone preserves history. Expertise reshapes the future. One Friday afternoon, our CFO joined a budget review meeting unexpectedly. Numbers came under scrutiny. Forecasts were challenged. Daniel began responding broadly. I let him. Then the CFO asked a pointed question about margin volatility assumptions. Silence. I answered precisely, referencing not just current projections, but historical variance bands from the last 4 quarters. The CFO leaned back. "Who built this model?" he asked. Daniel opened his mouth, then paused. "Matthew did," he said. It was a small moment, but small moments accumulate. After the meeting, I received a calendar invite from the CFO's office for a separate analytics discussion the following week. No announcement, no applause, just access. That's what they never noticed. While the interruptions continued publicly, my positioning was solidifying privately. Documentation gave me proof. Expertise gave me gravity. Consistency gave me calm. And calm is unsettling when someone expects resistance, because I wasn't fighting for credit anymore. I was building structural visibility. And structures once in place don't depend on volume to stand. The reveal didn't happen in a conference room. It happened alone at my desk on a Wednesday evening, long after most of the office lights had dimmed. I had just finished organizing 6 months of meeting recaps into chronological order. Subject lines aligned, attachments versioned, threads cross-referenced. When you see documentation individually, it looks administrative. When you see it collectively, it tells a story. I scrolled slowly. Early emails. Per discussion, the reallocation framework developed. Mid-quarter emails, as introduced in the initial modeling phase. Recent emails. Following up on the phased compliance structure previously outlined. The language was steady, calm, consistent. And then I opened the agency's quarterly leadership summary deck, compiled by department heads for executive review. Slide 12. Marketing Strategic Evolution, led by Daniel Reeves. Bullet points followed. Aggressive mid-funnel capture, phased compliance expansion, long-cycle nurture sequencing. My words, condensed, rebranded. But here was the difference now. Every bullet point in that leadership deck traced back, cleanly, verifiably, to email threads bearing my name, my timestamps, my attachments. For the first time, I didn't feel overlooked. I felt anchored, because leadership decks are narratives. email trails are evidence, and evidence doesn't argue. It waits. I leaned back in my chair and realized something quietly powerful. If anyone, HR, executives, finance, legal, ever needed clarity on strategic authorship, the answer wasn't subjective. It was documented. That was the leverage, not blackmail, not exposure, not confrontation. Clarity. At the same time, something else surfaced. In reviewing the CFO meeting notes from the week before, I noticed a side comment he had written in a follow-up thread. Recommend deeper integration of analytics leadership into strategic planning next fiscal year. Analytics leadership. That phrase hadn't included Daniel's name. It hadn't included mine either. But the only person consistently interfacing with finance on modeling had been me. I sat with that realization. The power dynamic I had been navigating wasn't just interpersonal. It was structural. Daniel's strength was executive presence in live rooms. Mine was intellectual ownership of the infrastructure behind those rooms. And infrastructure scales upward quietly. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. Clear that I no longer needed to defend myself verbally. Clear that the imbalance was no longer invisible. Clear that if opportunity or scrutiny ever arrived, I was prepared. The next morning, something subtle happened. During a retail strategy call, Daniel began to summarize an initiative. Then he paused mid-sentence. Matthew, can you outline the modeling assumptions here? He asked. Not as an afterthought, as a handoff. The room turned toward me. I explained the framework succinctly. No rush, no edge. After the meeting, I sent the recap. This time, Daniel replied publicly. Thanks, Matthew. Critical groundwork here. It was the first time he had used language that implied foundation instead of support. I didn't mistake it for a transformation. I recognized it as awareness. He knew the record existed. He knew I was no longer just the reliable executor. I was the documented source. That evening, as I closed my laptop, I understood something fully. The leverage wasn't about using the archive against him. It was about never needing to. Because once truth is consistently recorded, power recalibrates on its own timeline. Quietly, patiently, without spectacle. And I had reached a point where I could choose what to do next. Not from frustration, but from strength. There's a moment in every quiet power shift where you realize you have options, not emotional reactions. Options. By the time I reached that point, I had 3. Option 1, escalate. I could request a formal conversation with leadership, present the documentation, frame it as a pattern of misattribution. I had enough timestamps to make the narrative airtight, but escalation changes environments permanently. Even when you're right, you become the one who filed something. That label lingers. Option 2, leave. With the analytics certification nearly complete and direct relationships forming with finance and clients, my resume had strengthened. I could exit gracefully. Find an environment that values precision without performance overshadowing it. But leaving without recalibrating the narrative would mean the leadership deck still told a version of history that excluded me. Option 3, reposition from within. No confrontation, no accusation, no exit. Just a structural shift so clear that authorship could no longer be absorbed. That third option felt irreversible, not because it was aggressive, but because it would redefine hierarchy. And redefining hierarchy quietly is more disruptive than challenging it loudly. The decision crystallized during a fiscal planning workshop. The CFO had requested a deeper analytics integration proposal. Daniel assumed he would present it. Let's build something compelling, he said in our prep meeting. High level, forward-looking. I nodded, but this time, I didn't build a slide deck for him to deliver. I built a framework proposal, a formal document outlining creation of an analytics strategy lead role, direct reporting line to both finance and marketing, clear ownership boundaries between strategic modeling and executive presentation, defined attribution protocols in cross-functional initiatives. No accusations, no references to past dynamics, just structure. And in the executive workshop, when the CFO asked who had drafted the integration outline, I answered calmly, I did. There was a pause. Daniel glanced at me. Not irritated, not defensive, just surprised. The CFO leaned forward. This is comprehensive, he said. Have you considered formally stepping into this capacity? The room went quiet. I felt the weight of the past 6 months in that silence. This was the irreversible option. If I accepted visibility at that level, the old dynamic could not continue unchanged. Roles would solidify differently. Authority would be redistributed. I didn't rush. I'd be open to discussing scope and structure, I replied evenly. No victory, no edge, just alignment. After the meeting, Daniel walked beside me down the hallway. You didn't mention you were drafting a formal proposal, he said. His tone wasn't sharp, it was searching. You said we needed something compelling, I answered. I thought structure would be clearer than slides. He studied me for a moment. You're positioning yourself, he said quietly. It wasn't an accusation, it was recognition. Yes, I replied. That was the decision point. Not because I challenged him, but because I stopped shrinking. And once you choose structural visibility, you can't return to comfortable invisibility. The emails had prepared the record. The expertise had prepared the leverage. Now the structure would prepare the future. There would be consequences. Not explosive ones, but shifts ripple. And ripple effects reveal who relied on the old equilibrium. Once the possibility of a formal analytics strategy lead role entered the room, I didn't campaign for it. I didn't announce ambition. I didn't start acting differently in meetings. I didn't become louder. I became precise. The CFO scheduled a follow-up discussion for next week. Instead of looping Daniel into the initial calendar invite, his office sent it directly to me, with Daniel CC'd afterward. Small detail. Significant signal. In preparation, I did what I had always done. But now, with intention aligned to visibility, I compiled 6 months of documented modeling outcomes, forecast accuracy comparisons between my projections and final results, risk mitigation examples tied to compliance frameworks, email trails that clearly showed strategic origination points, not to accuse, to demonstrate continuity. During the meeting, the CFO asked direct questions about scalability. If we formalize this role, he said, how do we prevent strategic dilution across departments? Strategic dilution. I almost smiled at the irony of that phrase. We implement written alignment checkpoints, I replied calmly. Post-meeting documentation becomes standard protocol. Attribution is clarified at recap, not debated later. He nodded. So you'd institutionalize what you've already been doing? Yes. No one mentioned Daniel. No one needed to. Meanwhile, I maintained the same rhythm in team settings. Meeting, interruption, summary, recap, email. But something had changed in tone. Daniel interrupted less. Not entirely, just enough to signal awareness. In one session, when I began outlining a data constraint, he stopped himself mid-inhale and gestured for me to continue. That gesture said more than any apology would have. I didn't acknowledge it verbally. I simply finished my explanation. Behind the scenes, HR requested a formal role outline draft. I wrote it carefully. Neutral language, cross-functional benefit, measurable impact metrics. No self-promotion, no grievance, just structure. At home in the evenings, I reviewed my original spreadsheet, the one tracking attribution shifts. The pattern had flattened. Where credit had once blurred, it now appeared more consistently attached. Documentation had recalibrated memory. Then came the strategic action no one noticed immediately. I requested that all major client strategy decks include an authorship and modeling lead slide at the end, standardized across accounts. Not branded to me, institutional. Best practice for transparency, I framed it. Leadership approved without resistance. It sounded procedural, but procedures shape culture. And culture shapes power. When the next retail presentation went out, the final slide read, Strategic Modeling and Forecast Architecture, Matthew. Daniel presented the deck. He didn't remove the slide. He didn't comment on it. He left it intact. That's how quiet shifts solidify. Not through confrontation, through normalization of truth. Weeks passed. No announcement had been made yet about the new role. But in internal conversations, I began to hear something different. Ask Matthew. She owns the modeling. Loop her in early. She'll define the structure. Ownership had shifted from assumed support to recognized authority. And I hadn't raised my voice once. That's the part people misunderstand about quiet dominance. It isn't silence forever. It's silence until your structure speaks for you. The consequences didn't arrive as a confrontation. They arrived as an absence. Daniel was still respected, still charismatic, still the strongest voice in most rooms. But something subtle began slipping through his hands. In executive meetings, when strategic forecasting came up, eyes shifted toward me before he spoke. Not dramatically, just instinctively. He noticed. During one cross-department sync, the head of product asked, before we finalize this direction, can we get Matthew's modeling perspective? Daniel had already begun answering. He paused, then nodded toward me. It was a fraction of a second, but fractions accumulate. In client calls, I was increasingly invited earlier in the agenda, not as a follow-up explainer, but as an agenda anchor. Let's start with Matthew's framework, one VP suggested on a call. Daniel still facilitated the discussion, still summarized, still brought energy, but the gravitational center of technical credibility had shifted, and credibility, once relocated, rarely drifts back casually. I could feel his adjustment. He started preparing more thoroughly before meetings, referencing specifics instead of abstractions, checking assumptions with me beforehand. At first, I thought it was collaborative recalibration. Then I realized it was protective because the environment had changed. Documentation was no longer my private habit. It was embedded protocol. Authorship slides were standard, written recaps were expected. The system now preserves clarity automatically, and clarity limits improvisational ownership. One afternoon, I overheard Daniel in his office on a call with a senior partner. "We're building a stronger analytics spine," he said. "Matthew's leading that." The phrasing was careful, not supporting, leading. Later that week, the official announcement came. Subject line, introducing analytics strategy lead, Matthew. It wasn't framed as a promotion above Daniel. It was framed as cross-functional integration, reporting dotted line to finance, direct collaboration with marketing leadership. The email was concise, professional, forward-looking. Daniel forwarded it to the team with a simple note: excited to formalize what's already been strong work. I read that sentence twice. Formalize what's already been strong work. There was no bitterness in me, only recognition. The consequence for him wasn't humiliation. It was recalibration. He no longer controlled the full narrative of strategic direction. He controlled delivery. I controlled architecture. And architecture outlasts delivery cycles. The team adjusted quickly. They always do when the structure is clear. Junior strategists began approaching me directly for modeling questions instead of filtering through him. Finance looped me into early-stage budget planning without his mediation. In meetings, when he summarized my ideas, he now prefaced them differently. As Matthew outlined, not what we're really saying. That shift in language was small, but language shapes memory. One evening, as I packed up to leave, Daniel stopped by my desk. "You played this well," he said quietly. Not resentful, not admiring, just factual. "I documented," I replied. He gave a slight smile. "Yeah," he said, "you did." There it was. Not an apology, an acknowledgement. The consequences had begun. Not as collapse, but as balance. And balance feels strange when you've been standing slightly tilted for months. Once structure changes, tone follows. Not immediately, but inevitably. In the weeks after my new role was formalized, Daniel made subtle attempts to recalibrate our dynamic. More collaboration invites, more pre-meeting alignment calls, more visible acknowledgement in group settings. On the surface, it looked constructive, and it was, but there was an undercurrent I could feel. Urgency. Because something irreversible had already happened, not publicly, but internally within the organization's perception. Leadership now associates strategic accuracy with my name. That association is difficult to reverse once established. During a quarterly board prep session, Daniel opened the presentation as usual. He walked through positioning slides, market narrative, and high-level growth ambitions. Then came the analytics section. He transitioned smoothly. Matthew will walk us through the modeling assumptions and risk thresholds. Not an afterthought, a scheduled segment. I stood, remote in hand. As I explained the forecasting structure, one of the board members interrupted, not to dismiss, but to probe. "How confident are we in this margin stabilization curve?" I answered calmly, referencing 3 prior quarters of variance compression and the documentation trail of strategic adjustments that led there. The board member nodded. "Good," he said. That's the rigor we need." That phrase lingered. The rigor we need. After the meeting, the CEO stopped me briefly in the hallway. "Strong presence today," she said. "Clear, grounded, presence." For months, that word had been reserved for someone else. Later that afternoon, Daniel closed his office door for longer than usual. I didn't know what conversations were happening inside, but I knew this. Whatever recalibration he wanted to initiate now was reactive. And reactive positioning rarely restores original dominance. Because the shift, it hadn't been emotional. It had been documented. He couldn't undo the authorship slides. He couldn't unsend the recap emails. He couldn't erase the CFO's integration notes or the board's recognition. There was no scandal to repair, no grievance to negotiate, just a new equilibrium. One evening, he asked if we could grab coffee outside the office. We sat across from each other in a quiet cafe 2 blocks away. I didn't realize how much the documentation mattered, he said, stirring his cup slowly. It always matters, I replied. He exhaled lightly. I thought we were collaborating. We were, I said. But collaboration needs clarity. There was no accusation in my tone, no scorekeeping, just truth. He nodded. I can't undo the past few months, he said. No, I agreed gently, but we don't need to. That was the moment I understood something fully. It wasn't too late to repair a relationship, but it was too late to restore the old hierarchy, and that distinction is important. Repair is possible. Reversal isn't. The organization had adjusted its internal map, and maps, once redrawn, guide movement differently. We finished our coffee in relative silence. There was no dramatic apology, no confession, just 2 professionals recognizing that a system had evolved. And evolution doesn't ask permission from comfort. The real confrontation didn't happen in the cafe. It happened 3 weeks later in a glass conference room during a leadership off-site planning session. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no dramatic reveals, just clarity. We were reviewing next year's departmental structure when the CEO posed the direct question: how do we prevent strategic overlap between marketing leadership and analytics leadership? It was neutral, operational, but the room understood the subtext. Daniel answered first. Clear swim lanes, he said smoothly. Marketing owns narrative and client-facing strategy. Analytics owns modeling, forecasting, and structural guardrails. He paused. And we collaborate where those intersect. It was a well-constructed response. Then the CEO looked at me. Matthew, I didn't feel defensive. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. I agree with that delineation, I said calmly. And I'd add one layer: documented attribution during cross-functional initiatives. Not for credit, just for continuity. Silence. Not tense. Reflective. The CFO nodded first. That's already improved clarity significantly, he said. I'd support formalizing it. Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't redirect. He didn't summarize my point. He let it stand. That was the confrontation, not an argument. A boundary spoken without friction. After the session ended, he approached me while others filtered out. You didn't have to say that part about attribution, he said quietly. I did, I replied. It protects both of us. He studied me for a moment, and then something subtle happened. He nodded, not reluctantly, not defensively, just acknowledgement. For months, confrontation would have meant emotional escalation, defensiveness, risk. Now, confrontation was procedural. We were no longer negotiating ego. We were defining structure. That's the difference documentation makes. It removes the need for emotional proof. The proof already exists. Later that afternoon, during a breakout discussion, a junior strategist hesitated while presenting an idea. Daniel leaned forward instinctively, then stopped himself. Finish your thought, he said to her. She did. I noticed. So did she. Power recalibration doesn't only affect 2 people. It ripples outward. By the end of the offsite, attribution guidelines were added to the formal planning document. Authorship slides became mandatory across departments. Meeting recaps were institutionalized, not optional. There was no headline about it, no internal announcement celebrating culture change, just policy. And policy outlasts personalities. As we packed up to leave, Daniel walked beside me toward the elevator. You changed how this place operates, he said. I documented how it operates, I corrected gently. He gave a faint smile. Same difference. It wasn't, but I didn't argue, because for the first time since this began, there was nothing left to prove. When people ask what changed, they usually expect me to describe a moment of courage. A bold statement, a decisive confrontation, a breaking point, but that's not what redefined me. What changed was quieter. I stopped equating professionalism with self-erasure. For most of my career, I believed good work would surface naturally. That integrity would speak. That consistency would be recognized without reinforcement. Now I understand something more nuanced. Integrity needs structure. Without documentation, effort becomes anecdotal. Without clarity, contribution becomes a collaborative blur. Without a record, memory favors volume. I didn't become louder. I became visible in writing. That distinction reshaped not just my role, but my identity. I no longer sit halfway down the table to fade comfortably into contribution. I choose my seat deliberately now, not to dominate, but to anchor. When I speak, I finish my sentences. When someone builds on my idea, I let them. But I summarize clearly at the end. Just to restate the framework, it's not defensive, it's precise. Daniel and I still work together. Our dynamic is different now. There's mutual awareness where there once was assumption. He still commands rooms effortlessly, but he references structure before performance. And sometimes, rarely, but noticeably, he defers without hesitation. Not because he has to, because it makes sense. The younger strategists have started mirroring something, too. They send follow-up emails. They document ownership. They ask for clarity instead of waiting for recognition. Not aggressively, habitually. That might be the part I'm most proud of. Not the title, not the dotted line reporting structure, but the normalization of documentation as protection, not as an attack. I don't feel bitterness toward the past months. I feel gratitude for the lesson. Being underestimated can either shrink you or refine you. It refined me. I learned that silence isn't weakness, but unmanaged silence is. I learned that authority doesn't require volume, but it does require visibility. And most importantly, I learned that calm documentation is one of the most powerful forms of self-respect. I still carry the same black leather notebook into meetings, but now it's not just for capturing ideas. It's for capturing alignment, for ensuring that when the room's memory fades, the record remains. And I no longer wait for someone else to represent what I've built. I represent it myself, quietly, clearly, consistently. If you're waiting for a dramatic ending, there isn't one. No one was fired, no one was exposed, no reputations were destroyed. What changed was subtler and more lasting. The culture adjusted, because I did. When my director interrupted me in every marketing meeting, I could have matched his volume. I could have confronted him publicly. I could have left in frustration. Instead, I started sending follow-up emails, clear summaries, bullet points, ownership defined without accusation. He dismissed my ideas out loud. I documented everything in writing. And here's what I learned. Email trails are calm, but they don't forget. They don't shout. They don't humiliate. They don't dramatize. They simply preserve truth. Over time, preserved truth reshapes power. Not explosively, structurally. If you've ever been talked over, reframed, or quietly diluted in a professional space, I want you to hear this. You don't need to become louder to become undeniable. You need clarity. You need consistency. You need a record. Documentation isn't petty, heady. It's professional. It protects your ideas. It protects your growth. And sometimes it protects the integrity of the entire room. Quiet dominance isn't about winning against someone. It's about refusing to disappear. So here's the question I'll leave you with. If someone rewrote the narrative of your work tomorrow, would you have a record strong enough to tell the real story? I'd love to know your experience. Have you ever been interrupted, overlooked, or had your ideas reframed as someone else's? And if you handled it, how did you do it? Let's talk in the comments.